This is a frustrating element of this conflict, Matt. I mean, there's a level of incoherence in terms of the messaging, and we go from limited war aims or reducing threat, informing state behavior, to regime change. And any student of recent history would look at regime change in Libya, Iraq, and to a lesser extent Afghanistan, and say, well, when there's absent of high functioning society, a state, a reduction in the security apparatus, the consequences can be very deadly.
My name is Matthew McDonald, the creator of The Service, a documentary series I'm currently developing that I hope will become the definitive documentary series about Canadian intelligence operations. But that I also hope will help people see the world of intelligence and spies in a completely new way. But while I work to develop and make the full series, I decided to invite some of the people from the world of Canadian intelligence who have agreed to participate in the full series to join me to give me their insights and perspectives on what is quickly becoming one of the defining political crises of 2026, the war in Iran. In his speech at the World Economic Forum annual meeting in Davos, Switzerland, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney described the international rules-based order as partially false, because, as he pointed out, the strongest countries would simply exempt themselves whenever they want to. And now, with the US and Israeli attacks on Iran, we see the most powerful country in the world taking decisive action without even a pretense of adhering to any kind of rules-based international order.
America, regardless of what so-called international institutions say, is unleashing the most lethal and precise air power campaign in history.
Which is not to say that the Iranian regime wasn't or isn't a threat, but this crisis, at a time when the international order seems to be changing rapidly, raises a lot of questions. Here to discuss this complicated situation with me is Ruari Nicholson, a former senior officer with the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, where he served for nearly 30 years. Ruari has worked extensively on Middle East issues, including files related to Iran and nuclear proliferation. So thanks for joining me, Ruari.
Really appreciate it, Matt. Thanks for having me on.
No problem. So I'd like to start with what this conflict says about how the international order may or may not be changing, or how conflict may or may not be changing. It's not the first time the United States has taken unilateral action in the Middle East, but something about this conflict does seem different, and it's hard to tell if that's just because of President Trump or if something else is going on.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. So I think that every generation would assess that the complexities in the Middle East can't be any higher, and I think every decade those assumptions are proven wrong. So I think the current conflict represents, in my view, a pivot, a significant change in the geopolitical context. You've mentioned U.S. unilateralism, and I think, and you've also mentioned Canada's position. I think Prime Minister Mark Carney's comments related to nostalgia not being strategy demonstrate the fragility of that current Western consensus that informed our view of how we would manage the rules-based international order for a generation from World War II. So yeah, we're seeing a significant pivot, but key to that is U.S. A pivot towards U.S. Unilateralism. So I think your listeners would appreciate that none of this happens in isolation. I think what we're seeing is policymakers around the world are grappling with trying to shape foreign policy positions as it relates to this conflict, particularly as it pertains to the notion of it being a limited war, all the way to it being regime change and all the consequences associated with that. I think you're also seeing organizations like NATO grapple with how they're going to position themselves. They're increasingly getting drawn in terms of maritime security, but also questions around the future efficacy and the stability of the entire notion of NATO, and particularly as it relates to U.S. administration moves in this conflict. So I think that's some of the key issues. In the margins, we've also got actors like Russia who recently reported were providing targeting information to Iranian forces as it relates to U.S. installations. So that's certainly something of great concern. In my background, obviously, as you've mentioned, as a CSIS officer, focused on parts of my career on the Iranian file. Certainly, our focus was MOIS, IRGC operations in Canada. You mentioned nuclear proliferation, so that was certainly a preoccupation. But I think central to a lot of the thinking and some of the partnerships that existed at that time and continue to exist is Israeli security. And I think it's really important to bring that out. I think Andy talked about this a little bit in his podcast, but you have to consider anytime you meet with the Israeli partnership, any partners on the Israeli side, they'll always talk about the ring of fire, Iranian-backed proxies surrounding their borders, and that's for many years has been a significant preoccupation for the Israelis for obvious reasons. But I think it's hard to underestimate the impact of October 7th on the Israeli nation. And I think it's clear that the Israeli leadership have determined to end the threat root and branch. And so I talked a little bit about limited war. So the limited war aims are just reducing threat. That's doesn't really speak to the secondary effects of the conflict in terms of an exodus of Iranian population, a very fragile or potentially failed state in Iran. These are significant concerns. So in my view, I don't think the politics have caught up to the war aims.
You mentioned Russia sharing intelligence with Iran, which is something I've read about as well, and I'm curious about your thoughts about how that might change the nature of this conflict.
Well, I'm not convinced that Russia is going to play a profound role in this conflict. They'll seek advantage, and I think that reporting suggests that's the case. They have a long-standing relationship with Iran, as does China. They were heavily involved in Syria. So, I mean, it's not that Russia is exclusively focused on the Ukrainian conflict. They have intelligence apparatus around the world. So if they seek advantage, that would be an obvious play. So while I'm not convinced that it's confirmed reporting, it's certainly within the realm of possibility that you'd have Russian security forces having that level of connectivity that they would provide that information.
Getting back to Canada just for a moment, it's not obviously a central military player in the region, but we've seen warnings from the Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity, for example, about possible reprisals from Iran's proxy network. Obviously, Canada is still affected by the crisis. Plus, CSIS does operate internationally to monitor threats to Canada. Based on your experience with the service, what does this conflict look like from a Canadian strategic perspective?
So I think a number of features. I think one of them would be alliance politics. So obviously, again, reflecting on Davos and some of the Canadian positions as it relates to the rule-based international order, there's, I think, consistent concern. I look at it from an intelligence perspective, the efficacy of the Five Eyes, the extreme importance of pooling our resources, prioritizing targets, putting our best foot forward where we have influence and access. This is fundamental to our security. So from a Canadian perspective, that's certainly going to be a preoccupation that that level of connectivity and sharing continue to persist, because it informs our view, particularly in a strategic context, it informs our view of the secondary effects of this conflict and the potential consequences. And then again, organizations like NATO, what are the impacts? What is the potential for NATO to be increasingly drawn into this conflict, either by design or by accident, in terms of putting assets in the region, which could potentially be targeted? So that's certainly a preoccupation for Canadian policymakers. I think economic security is a secondary feature. And so obviously, in terms of global energy markets and the impact on our own economy, that's going to be a significant preoccupation for policymakers in Canada. And I think the potential, and it's real, the Canadian citizens are going to see the effects of this conflict in the near term. In terms of, you see it, many reports in terms of the effect on food prices, on energy prices. So this is something that could be felt in the near term. And obviously that impact will then resonate with our decision makers and political leaders. From a domestic security context, I mean, we've got a significant Iranian diaspora. I mean, there's going to be continued preoccupation on the part of the Canadian Security Intelligence Service to ensure that foreign influenced activity is not occurring. But, we'd also want to identify any nascent threats that may emerge in the future as it relates to targeting Canadian interests. So that's going to be something that our organization, CSIS, is going to be keenly focused on, and it has been for many, many years. I think, the systemic instability is also something that is extremely important. So what does this mean for, you've talked about it in your opening remarks in terms of the fraying fabric of the rules-based international order. So what are the ramifications here in terms of that, what we traditionally would have called Western consensus? Because this conflict, frankly, has had an absence of that consensus. I think both in terms of, pre-attack consultation, coordination, a common view of outcomes. I just don't see that. And I think that is demonstrated by the lack of coherence in terms of political positions on the conflict, which have wavered left and right.
You mentioned the Five Eyes. And I'm curious, in this conflict in particular, CSIS must share intelligence with other agencies as well. I'm thinking especially of Israeli intelligence in this case. Can you talk a little bit about how Canada and the Canadian intelligence community work not only with Five Eyes partners, but with other allied intelligence agencies, like, for example, Israeli intelligence?
Yeah, I think it's important to say that intelligence organizations can't do everything. And I'll give you an example. So, we talk about nuclear proliferation, particularly with the Iran target. And we may have some key assets, either signals intelligence or human intelligence or geospatial. But, we've got a whole range of other priorities. So one of the values in terms of the Five Eyes community is to be able to have those conversations to say, let's leverage an existing asset in one dimension, and we'll compare that against collection in another dimension. And at the end, you're getting a pretty comprehensive view of a threat. So I think that's key. It's you're pooling your resources, you're pooling your assets, your capabilities to good effect, which made sense and informed our view of how we're going to manage intelligence globally for a generation. And I talked about World War II. Really, that was the impetus to create this community of sharing partners. So, and that includes the United States, which has traditionally been an extremely important and strong partner for Canadian intelligence. And it's my hope and anticipation that eventually that relationship normalizes and we can go back to the level of cooperation that we enjoyed for so long. With other partners, we have countless relationships across the world with partners, not necessarily just on this specific topic, but a whole host of threats. And I think those are important. There's extremely strong relations with a number of Arab states, including information sharing, training opportunities, et cetera. And then, of course, Israel. And I mentioned that in terms of, how the Israeli security can really inform our view of Middle East conflict and politics, and that relationship is equally strong. In terms of this conflict, the level of consultation that occurred prior to the launch of strikes, I am not aware. But again, I think as I mentioned earlier, there's a level of incoherence in terms of the collective approach. And that may demonstrate that the war aims and political aims that were articulated were not broadly messaged. And so, we talk a lot about limited war. So if a limited war is to inform state behavior, that's one thing. If it's to reduce threat, that's another thing. But once you get into a dimension where you're talking about regime change, that's no longer a limited war. And so, the consequences that we're seeing in terms of potentially significant exodus from Iran, the potential to see a fractured Iran state or a failed state. You can sort of do the math in terms of what that would look like, having a fractured state where you'd have internecine conflict, potential for other actors in the region to take advantage of the lack of stability and security in Iran, the potential for a narco state. I mean, there's lots of consequences here. And again, I refer to those as being secondary effects, but whether those were all well considered, if you look at this in the concept of a limited war, it's not clear.
You mentioned that the international system is changing, and I'm curious if this crisis is telling us anything more broadly about how it's changing. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that, for generations, security architecture that governed the Middle East was, I would say, led by the United States, sometimes as a counterpoint to other influences. But the key point there was it was based on institutions and structures that supported significant sharing and political connectivity that created resolve and created, firm positions in terms of how the international community was going to manage conflict in the Middle East. And I think the key of this conflict is that that's relatively absent. And so everybody's trying to play catch up. And then you see sort of the drip of European countries becoming involved, sending naval assets into the area. And as I mentioned earlier, the potential there for something to go very, very wrong and have nations almost accidentally drawn into a conflict, either for force protection or defensive measures, it's pretty high. So it's just that the lack of political coordination here makes it very dissimilar from previous conflicts in the Middle East, where the ground game and the long-term play were probably less well articulated and understood.
You mentioned European countries perhaps being drawn into this conflict, and Mark Carney, for example, has supported the aims of this conflict, but has not committed Canadian military to this operation yet. But he also hasn't ruled that out. Do you see a scenario in which the Canadian military somehow gets drawn into this conflict?
I think the CDS has made representation in terms of what that might look for. So I think they are preparing the Canadian population for a possible role. What that might look like, it's not clear at this point. I think Canada's taken a pretty nuanced position on this. Well, we've obviously hit the priority in terms of our continued determination to see nuclear deterrence work in the region. We've also championed, I would say, a diplomatic solution here, a de-escalation of the conflict, which is key. Now, how much influence Canada would have politically in terms of informing that, it's not clear. But I think the Prime Minister's taken a pretty firm position in a rapidly evolving and devolving situation that I would say is in the traditions of our country. So would a future role potentially be peacekeeping? I think it's premature to even suggest that's the case because we're simply not there. But yeah, I think that, layered on top of that, two things. One, we've got, I think the emergence almost of a revolution in military affairs where you're seeing hybrid warfare at a high level. So you talked about in a previous interview podcast, the effects of cyber war in this conflict. And, people are watching proxy forces, the ubiquitous use of drones, and smart munitions, which, I think in a sense you could have seen that to an extent in Ukraine, but this is at a much higher level. And so military forces, military leaders, political leaders around the world are watching and seeing the impact. But again, I go back to the notion that, the war aims here don't necessarily can't be reconciled about the long-term political effect. So winning the battle may not be the issue, right? And I think that's emerging as a major theme and preoccupation for policymakers around the world. And there's the potential for blood and treasure to be impacted here. So you talked about European nations; they're keenly concerned about being drawn further into this conflict.
You mentioned proxy forces. I'm wondering, based on your work dealing with Iran, if you can describe how Iran's proxy network works. Andy Ellis was talking a little bit about this with me as well
Yeah,
last week.
with I would say against, not with.
Mm,
Yeah. So the proxy forces in the region. I think let's say from a Canadian domestic security intelligence perspective, preoccupation for the proxy forces would have been identifying, discerning support operations that were conducted in Canada, either amongst the diaspora or in other groups, leveraging Canadian charities to do fundraising. So that was a principal preoccupation. And in that respect, we worked very closely within the Five Eyes to identify that activity and find the ways and means to inhibit that. So that was, I'd say, a traditional view of Canada from a domestic context, was to try and identify that those funding networks and those support networks. In terms of Iranian intelligence operations, I'd say there's sort of twofold. One would be MOIS, which would be principally run out of missions, Iranian missions around the world. So, similar to how you look at the Russian intelligence service succession officer, there'd be a succession of officers being posted to Canada who would have certain missions here. And that's a very traditional view of what intelligence looks like and what intelligence operators, the kind of activity they would conduct. I think the second feature would be more the illegal element, where you would have IRGC officers potentially undercover operating in Canadian communities. So there's those two dimensions: more traditional intelligence operations and more covert intelligence operations. And I think Andy touched on some of his experiences in terms of the IRGC, depicting it as these are very expensive operations, requiring a lot of training and focus. And so in my experience, sort of the two principal priorities were the nuclear question, and then secondly, more traditional intelligence operations in Canada.
I've heard Iran described as an especially difficult intelligence target. I just wonder if you can describe exactly why that is.
Yeah, so it's a very non-permissive environment. It's extremely dangerous in terms of the deployment of human assets into the region. I mean, I'll talk about human assets. There's obviously other ways and means to collect intelligence, many different ways. But in terms of, like, let's say the traditional use of human assets to penetrate either political, military, social structures in Iran, the high functioning of Iranian intelligence organizations and their ability to effectively lock down the country means that those types of operations would be conducted remotely. So we wouldn't actually put handlers on the ground. The assets would be deployed, and obviously detection would result in very severe consequences. So that's you can certainly use certain means to mitigate that risk, but it's never going to be reduced to zero. So these are complex, have to be very thoughtful operations. I think it's also important to identify that, with the very significant Canadian diaspora in Canada, there's also ways to collect intelligence, even if it's ambient, on, the political structures, state intentions, based on interviews conducted in Canada with a diaspora that has significant community of the homeland. Significant connectivity with the homeland. And so that's an important point to make, is that we don't necessarily have to get into the country to be able to collect very important information. I talked earlier about the Five Eyes. One of the strengths of our intelligence efforts is that we do have that access to a significant range of communities, which can be extremely beneficial in understanding some of the nuances of the target nation.
So I imagine that recruiting human sources, to monitor Iran or to gather intelligence about Iran is especially difficult. You talked about handling sources that might be in Iran remotely and then working with people that are in Canada that might be able to provide information. Can you describe a little bit about the unique challenges of recruiting human sources when it comes to Iran?
I don't think it's entirely unique. I think the approach would be similar to any hard target in terms of convincing. I mean, at the end of the day, the first thing you're going to look at is access, and that's going to be key. So you're going to do a significant workup of an individual prior to any approach. So you can understand their capabilities, you'd understand their personality, you'd understand the type of access they could enjoy, and then obviously you have to consider a context where they can enter the country, and what would that look like, and how would they, how would you provide the support required, considering that really any communication in country is relatively impossible. Then you've also got to give them a certain pretext to be able to travel abroad and potentially meet with your officers. And that's difficult, right? Because people are being monitored. So anybody who's going to travel out to a third country is going to be flagged. So you have to really provide that significant cover to be able to debrief these individuals. So I'd suggest that's that's certainly a challenge.
So how do you ensure the safety of the sources? Like, how do you handle that in these types of situations?
There's no 100% solution, Matt. I mean, there's you want to, if you're going to send, I'll reflect on cover operations. You want to keep it as close to the reality as possible. So you want to make sure that it's nuanced, it's subtle. You want to be able to control the personality of the individual so they don't become too aggressive and then highlight themselves. So I think the key there is a significant amount of training that would occur in preparations for deployment. And if you're talking about domestic operations, source operations, the level of training is important, but it's next level when you're talking about deploying somebody into a nation like Iran, where the state security apparatus is so high functioning, and they're very keen and capable relative to identifying Western assets or foreign assets. So the key point there is ensuring that these individuals live as close to their context as possible, and that they have significant training to be able to conduct these operations so that they don't make mistakes, because one mistake can be deadly.
This is getting a little bit away from the discussion of the Iran conflict, but I'm curious because I think a lot of people might not be aware of this. So when you're talking about training, you're talking about training that human sources would receive from the service itself? Is that
That's
the way
correct.
that typically works?
Yeah.
So can you describe a little bit about the types of things that that the service would be focused on in that training? Like what is the service trying to make sure these human sources know how to do properly?
I think I've covered that. I don't want to get into specific details about the type of training, because
Sure.
I don't want to go off message in terms of my organization or my former organization, because I am retired.
Hmm.
So I'll leave it at that, Matt, just in terms of that the training exists, that the effort there is to mitigate the risk
Hmm.
and reduce the exposure of the asset while in country,
Sure.
so that their safety and security are set as a priority. But again, I mean, I think it's important to say is in any operation abroad, there's a higher level of risk, and that risk can never be reduced to zero. So you always have to consider that. And there's also the other option, and I think it's a mature and important discussion, is that if a human source operation has reached its end, it's important to know that. And at that point, the asset should be withdrawn,
Hmm.
or we separate and we cut the relationship. But that's difficult to do, because when you've invested money, time, etc., into a human source operation, there is always the potential that you're going to see more collection opportunities. But if the, it's a balancing act in a sense. If the level of or the potential for identification of the asset is at a high level, I think it's important to have that mature conversation around cessation of the operation.
Getting back to the conflict with Iran right now, based on your experience in the intelligence world and working on Iran, do you have any sense of the kinds of discussions going on among Iran's leaders or within Iran's intelligence community about how they either are or should be responding to this crisis?
I think it's been overwhelming, Matt. So, a new leader has been selected. Some reports say interim. But I think they're grappling with the magnitude of the impact of the strikes. But I think, in the longer run, we're talking about a culture that has existed for thousands of years, one that's based on, I think diplomacy, and they would certainly want to seek an end to the hostilities. And I think there's been overtures in that regard. To what extent that's advanced, I'm not aware, but that would certainly be a preoccupation for the leadership, is to come to some kind of agreement or consensus with Western powers, despite, I'd say public indications that there's no surrender. But I think the longer term effect would be how do they view both Iranian society and the country writ large. So, it's a multicultural country in many respects. There's significant regional fractures and differences. So, they're probably looking at the challenge in the long run of keeping the Iranian state coherent and intact. Because I mentioned earlier, a failed state, based on a regional power that's had such significant influence in the region, would be an international security challenge. So I think there's that would certainly be a preoccupation of the Iranian regime. And there's some hard hearts there, particularly when you talk about IRGC. So it'll be interesting to see the dynamic that unfolds in terms of the positioning of the political class versus the IRGC particularly, and if there is any fissures or gaps that open in terms of how to approach the conflict.
President Trump has talked about how he wants Iran to completely surrender. He's also earlier mentioned regime change. We've talked about that a little bit. It's hard to say exactly how things are going to go in the next few days or weeks or months, but I'm curious if you have any thoughts about how things might develop based on your experience in the region.
Well, this is a frustrating element of this conflict, Matt. I mean, like I mentioned earlier, there's a level of incoherence in terms of the messaging, and we go from limited war aims where we're reducing threat, informing state behavior, to regime change. And any student of recent history would look at regime change in Libya, Iraq, and to a lesser extent Afghanistan, and say, well, when there's absent of high functioning society, a state, a reduction in the security apparatus, the consequences can be very deadly. In 2005, as an example, I was posted to Iraq, and this was just in the aftermath of demobilization of the Iraqi army, and at that point, the Ba'athist Party had been declared illegal. And the consequences are clear now, maybe not so much at the time, but what you saw was both sectarian violence at a high level, costing tens of thousands of lives, both, allied forces and the very unfortunate Iraqi civilians. But also, you saw the fact that this occurred fomenting an insurgency which engulfed the entire country. So, I think, not to get Clausewitzian here, but when you have a conflict where the political objectives are poorly articulated, it can certainly lead to a broader conflict. And I think that's what the concern is. And I think we're seeing examples of that on an hourly and daily basis.
Hmm. Well, and we're already seeing, unfortunately, massive civilian death and destruction, it seems at least. And that's obviously something that's going to create resentment, and you're going to have instability and, possibly,
Yeah.
other violence that is a response to that. Are there any particular lessons that you think that we can learn about the changing nature of the global order or conflict in general from this conflict so far?
It's my keen hope that we can see a return to a more normalized relationship with some of our key partners. Well, one key partner, specifically the United States. As I mentioned throughout my career, and I can reflect on almost 30 years of service to Canada with CSIS. That relationship was absolutely important. It was essential, and so there's many good friendships, but I can give you many instances of where that intelligence sharing shaped our view of the world, but also neutralized threats domestically and internationally. So, it is my keen hope that this level of unilateralism that currently exists morphs into something that's more similar to our historic relationship. And whether that's, a change in administration or realization that going it alone is fraught with potential pitfalls, it's unclear. But I certainly, that would be, I think, my anticipation, but also my hope that occurs, because without that consensus, this runs into adventurism, and I think the impact more globally, seeing nations being drawn into the conflict is profoundly concerning.
Hmm. Indeed. All right. Well,
Yeah, and the only other thing I would say, in terms of the threat, because we talked about looking at the Iranian population, and I think that's extremely unfortunate when you're seeing innocents unfortunately killed and wounded. But, we talked a little bit about hybrid warfare, and there is a concern there that the security apparatus and military, they cannot fight a conventional war, will resort to hybrid warfare. So there is the potential to seeing non-traditional targets hit by either proxy forces, Iran-backed proxy forces, or by Iranian operatives, and that would certainly be a concern for any Western nation. And so I think intelligence services have to be keenly aware of that threat. We've seen some incidents more domestically generated in the States, but if we're talking about state-sponsored activity as a response, that's something we also have to concern ourselves with.
well, thanks for taking the time to share your thoughts with me today, Rory. It's certainly a
Always a
distressing,
pleasure.
complex situation. Take care.